Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 3 English lesson on adjectives. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English language arts, grade 3. And the chapter that we're going to be focusing on is adjectives. And this is a continuation of the lesson that we did yesterday. And yesterday, specifically, we focused on adjectives. We spoke on adjectives that tells us what kind and how many, and we went over when to know the difference between adjectives that tells us or asks us what kind, or adjectives that tells us or asks us how many, right? And usually when it's how many, then it can be in numbers. It's something that you can count, right? What kind can be in size, weight, height, color, right? Texture. That is how we describe like the noun, as in what kind of noun, right? So now we are going to identify adjectives, right? Because we did not finish all of the lessons under the chapter of adjectives, right? So we're going to identify the adjective that describes the noun, and we're going to identify the adjective. So we're basically going to identify the adjective. All right. So remember adjectives, right? So we can say an adjective, it tells us more about the noun. So adjectives tell us more about the noun, right? And remember, a noun is either it tells us about a person, a place, a thing. It tells us either an animal, right? So whatever thing, animal, place, or person that you're identifying, right? The adjective will tell us more about that specific noun, right? Or we can say the adjective. We can even say adjectives. They describe, or we can say modify the noun, right? Because that is what adjectives do. So an adjective either tells us more about the noun, or we can say the adjective describes a noun, or it modifies a noun. So we said in our previous lesson that adjectives, they either tell us what kind, right? So adjectives, they can tell us what kind. And we have adjectives that tell us how many. Right? So in a sentence, right, depending on what your adjective is that describes your noun, you will be able to identify if this specific adjective is asking me what kind, or telling me what kind, or is it telling me how many. All right. And if we look at a few sentences, right, that will tell us what kind, right? So for those of you who just basically that just came, we said that this is a continuation of our previous lesson, right? In our previous lesson, which was yesterday, we did adjectives, and we specifically focus on adjectives that tell us what kind and adjectives that tell us how many, all right? And our lesson for today is going to be where we're going to identify the adjective, and we're going to identify the adjective within a specific sentence, right? But to go over our previous lesson, we specifically made mention that adjectives, firstly, an adjective tells us more about a noun, and nouns are, it basically tells us about people, places, animals, or things, right? Those are nouns, which means that the adjective describes that noun, right? So let's say we have our noun, and our nouns consists of people, it consists of places, consists of animals, it consists of things, right? So if we were to, for example, identify, let's say, people, right? People can either be a name of a person, right? It can either be, you think of a name, it can either be Seth, that's just the shortest name that I chose, or it can be girl, right? Because remember, a name of a person can either be the actual name of the person, right? It's your proper noun, or it can just be a common noun where it can be girl, boy, right, without mentioning the name. Then we have places, like it's either school or it can be park, right? An animal can either be dog or it can be the name Spotty. Things can either be a bed or it can be dress, right? So that is a few examples of nouns, right? Nouns, it describes places, people, animals, things, and the names in blue are basically just one or two, let's say basically two of each of the nouns, right? So adjectives, they describe people, they describe places, they describe animals and things. If we were to describe, for example, Seth, we can maybe say Seth is tall. If we describe the girl, we can maybe say it's a beautiful girl, right? Because we are describing the girl. She's beautiful. If we describe maybe Seth, then we can maybe say Seth is tall, or we can say Seth is smart, right? But that is how we describe the person. It tells us more about the person. So if we're having a conversation about the girl or about Seth, then we are either having a conversation about how smart they are, how beautiful they are, how tall they are, right? Then, for example, we have places, right? We also said that adjectives describe or tells us more about places. School, we can say my school is big. My school is, um, I have a small school. I have a very strict school. The park is beautiful and green, right? But you're describing it. The animals, if you describe animals, you can say my dog is, it's black and furry, right? Spotty, has got a lot of black and white spots, but you are describing it, right? But now, when it comes to adjectives, it tells us what kind, right? Then we can, for example, say, if we now made an example of Seth, right? Then we can say, um, we can describe Seth as being smart, right? Or he is a very tall, he is, or we can even say he's tall, right? So he's a tall boy. Or we can say she is a beautiful girl. So which means that the adjective that tells us what kind, right? It means that tall describes Seth as the boy, and beautiful describes the girl, right? And that tells us what kind of girl. It's a beautiful girl. What kind of boy? It's a tall boy, right? We can say we bought 5 apples, right? So the word five tells us how many apples we bought, right? We can even say there are, let's say there are 2 dogs barking, right? There are 2 dogs barking. Two describes how many dogs there are, right? So that is basically just part of, again, us describing adjective that tells us what kind, and adjectives that tells us how many, because there were quite a few questions yesterday where some learners asked, where some students asked, how do we know the difference between what kind and how many? Remember, what kind, when we describe something by saying what kind, and then we can say it's either in weight, in height, how smart you are, how the colors, right? Even if we were to describe the dress, right? Then we can say, um, Amy wore a black dress, right? So black, it tells us what kind of dress she wore, right? You can even say she wore a beautiful black dress. And then both beautiful and black will be the adjective that describes this dress, that tells us about this dress. So now it's like you're asking yourself, what kind of dress is she wearing? A black dress. What type of boy is he? He's a tall boy. He's a smart boy, right? What kind of girl is she? She's a beautiful girl. How many apples are there? There's 5 apples. How many dogs are barking? 2 dogs are barking. And that is how you'll be able to see the difference between adjectives that tells us what kind and adjectives that tells us how many, right? And once again, an adjective, it tells us more about the noun. And we said nouns are either people, places, animals, or things. And we made we basically wrote down a few examples of the different kind of nouns. And then we said adjectives, they tell us what kind and they tell us how many. And then we also wrote down a few example sentences of adjectives that either tells us what kind and adjectives that tells us how many. All right, so now we're going to aplusstudents.ca, right? And we're first going to identify the adjectives that describes the nouns, and then we're just going to identify the adjective. And once again, we said that an adjective is a word that tells us more about a noun, right? Or we can say it describes a noun, or we can say it modifies a noun, right? And some adjectives, they ask the question, what kind, right? For example, it says the small baby smiled. What baby smiled? The small baby. So small is our adjective that describes the baby. She carried heavy books. What kind of books did she carry? Heavy books. So heavy is our adjective that describes the books. Then we have some of our adjectives that tells us how many, all right? And we say one baby smiled. How many babies smiled? Only one baby smiled. So one is our adjective that tells us how many. And then we have she carried some books. So can you see, instead of saying she carried 5 books, 10 books, 2 books, we can also say some, right? So she carried some books. And some basically tells us how many. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be a number where it says 1 to 10 or whatever. It can either also, we can even say some, a lot, right? Those are also words that we can use to tell us how many. All right. So now we're first going to do a few examples and then we're going on to our test. We're going to select the adjective that tells you what kind. So we're going to select the adjective that tells us what kind. It says, Zach has a red belt. Zach has a red belt. We need to ask or identify the adjective that tells you what kind. What is the adjective within that sentence that tells us what kind? Is it Zach? Is it has? Is it a? Is it red? Or is it belt? Guys, are we doing maths in an English class currently? We are doing English, everybody. Please, can we just focus? So it says Zach has a red belt. The question is, you need to select the adjective that tells you what kind. All right, so if we were to identify the adjective that tells us what kind, then yes, red is our adjective. So red tells us what kind. It tells us what kind of belt does Zach have. Zach has a red belt. So red is our adjective, right? It describes the belt. Beautiful. Yes, it describes the belt. So it's a red belt, but red is our adjective. Well done. Dalton did a silly dance. Dalton did a silly dance. What kind of dance did Dalton do? We need to identify the adjective by telling us what kind. Dalton did a silly dance. All right. And if we were to identify the adjective, right? And then the adjective is silly, right? Remember, only the adjective, right? Because the noun is, dance. But silly is, it describes the type of dance that it did. So silly is our adjective. So well done. There are some spiders by the window. There are some spiders by the window. We need to select the adjective that tells us how many. So there are some spiders by the window. We need to identify the adjective that tells us how many. All right. And if we were to select the adjective that tells us how many, then it is some, right? Because it tells us how many spiders are by the window. So there are some spiders by the window. So our adjective is some. And it tells us how many spiders there are by the window. All right, so now we're going on to our test, right? And we are going to identify the adjectives that tells us what kind and the adjectives that tells us how many, right? All right, so we need to select the adjective that tells you what kind. The adjective that tells you what kind. It says, look at the beautiful butterfly. Look at the beautiful butterfly. The adjective that tells us what kind, is it at or is it beautiful? So look at the beautiful butterfly. Is it act that tells us what kind, or beautiful that tells us what kind? All right. And if we were to select the adjective that tells us what kind, then we would say it is beautiful because beautiful describes the butterfly. It's a beautiful butterfly. We need to select the adjectives that tells us what kind. It says Mitchell has a red belt. Mitchell has a red belt. The adjective that tells us what kind, is it A or is it red? A or is it red? Remember, only the adjective, right? Not the adjective and the noun. So is it A or is it red? So yes, well done. It is red, right? And yes, red describes the belt. Beautiful. It is a red belt, but remember, only the adjective is red. So well done, guys. We need to select the adjectives that tells us what kind. It says Emma sang a pretty song. Emma sang a pretty song. What is the adjective? Is it sang or is it pretty? Emma sang a pretty song. All right, and if we were to describe the adjective or select the adjective that tells us what kind, then we would say pretty because it describes the type of song that she sings. It's a pretty song. All right, we need to select the adjective that tells us what kind. That was a wonderful play. What kind of play was that? Was it wonderful or play? What is the adjective within that sentence? All right, and if we were to select the adjective, right, that tells us what kind, then we can say wonderful describes the play. It was a wonderful play, right? So option one is correct. All right, let's do one more. Select the adjective that tells us what kind. Dalton did a silly dance. Dalton did a silly dance. Is it silly or is it dance that describes or that tells us what kind? It's the adjective that tells us what kind. All right. And if we were to select the adjective that tells us what kind, then we can say silly describes the kind of dance that Dalton did. So well done, everybody. Well done. All right. So now we're going on to the next one that says we need to identify adjectives, right? And we said that with adjectives, we it tells us more about the noun, right? It either tells us or it asks the question what kind, or it asks the question how many. And remember, words like articles, they are not adjectives, right? So do not select articles. Articles are words like a and the. That is not an adjective, right? So whether it says a dress, an apple, right? The apple or something, that is not an adjective, right? So words like articles, articles are a and the, those are not adjectives, right? So those are not adjectives. So we have adjectives that asks us or that tells us what kind, and we have adjectives that will tell us how many, right? And with how many, it tells us it doesn't even necessarily have to tell us a specific number. It's like saying there are 16 students listening or participating on A plus, right? So the question now is how many students are participating? 16, right? So 16 is the adjective that tells us how many, right? Or we can say some students are not listening, right? So some is then the adjective, right? So it can either be words like some or it can be an actual number that tells us how many. And then with what kind, it can be small, big, heavy, it can be light, it can be tall, it can be beautiful, it can be silly, it can be ugly. And remember, not people are ugly, things are ugly, right? um it can be in height, weight, color, right? That is what I said when it comes to identifying what kind or answering the question what kind, right? All right, so now we're going to select the adjective within a specific sentence, right? So we're going to look at the first one. It says the purple dress fits her. The purple dress fits her. What is the adjective within that sentence? It says the purple dress fits her. What is the adjective within that sentence? What kind? It basically tells us what kind. So we're going to identify the adjective within the sentence. So we need to select the adjective. What is the adjective within that sentence? It says the purple dress fits her. We need to identify the adjective within that sentence. All right, then if we were to select the adjective within that sentence, then it will be purple because purple describes the dress that fits her, right? Some brown bears look for food in the forest. Some brown bears look for food in the forest. They say that we need to select two adjectives within the sentence? Some brown bears look for food in the forest. We need to select two adjectives within that sentence. Some brown bears look for food in the forest. What are the two adjectives within that sentence? One will tell us what kind, and one will tell us how many. So, some brown bears look for food in the forest. What are the two adjectives within that sentence? One tells us what kind, and the other one will tell us how many. All right, that's one of it. What is the other one? That one tells us how many. We are describing the bear. We are describing the bear. And we're going to describe the bears in how many, and we're going to describe the bear in what kind. So some is correct, yes, and some tells us how many. What is the other one? What is the other adjective within that sentence that tells us what kind, that describes the bear? All right, and the second adjective is brown, right? So which means that it says some brown bears look for food. Instead of us just saying bears look for food in the forest, we are saying some brown bears look for food in the forest. We could have said brown bears look for food in the forest, right? Or we could have said some bears look for food in the forest. But we are describing it as some brown bears, right? All right, so now let's go to our test, right? Where we are going to identify the adjective. We need to select the adjective. Do not select articles like a, an, or the, right? The town has three banks. The town has three banks. What is the adjective within that sentence? Is it town or is it three? The town has three banks. All right, and if we were to select the adjective, we would say three, right? Because it tells us how many banks the town has, right? So well done. Is it rejoice? Several beavers built the dam. Several beavers built the dam. What is the adjective within that sentence? Is it several or is it built? Is it built or is it several? So several beavers built the dam. What is the adjective within that sentence? Is it built or is it several? And if we were to select the adjective, right, then we would say it is, yes, well done. It seems like rejoice is the only one that is present and focusing. So it is several. It tells us basically how many dams they built. So well done. We saw some buffaloes. We saw some buffaloes. We need to select the adjective. We saw some buffaloes. Is it saw or is it some? We need to select the art. We need to select the adjective. Is it saw or some? How many? It tells us how many. So we saw some buffaloes. What is the adjective within that sentence? This is the last one. All right. And if we were to select the adjective, right, then some tells us how many buffaloes we saw. So well done, guys. All right, so that is now our lesson on adjectives. We said adjectives, they tell us more about the noun, or we can say it describes a noun, or we can say it modifies the noun. Remember, nouns are people, places, it is things, it's animals, right? Which means that our adjective describes either people, places, animals, or things, right? Adjectives, they can either ask the question, what kind, like what kind of noun, what kind of person, animal, place, or thing, or how many of those, right? When it comes to what kind, it can either be described as in the color, the weight, the height, the size, right? Maybe with how many it is, how many it's the number. It doesn't necessarily have to be the number, it can be some, several, many, and so on, right? So that is now the end of our lesson on adjectives. Thank you very much, grade three, for joining the class. I really hope that you're going to have a good day further. Goodbye.